Everybody, good evening and welcome to tonight's webinar. I am your host, Dr. Jed Appleruth. Going to be talking to you about a topic I've talked about for a long time, testing. Things that are going on in the world of admissions testing to make sure you have full information to help guide you in your process, help you with your kids, your students. Tonight, we're going to cover a deck, which has a lot of good information, I think. I tweak it all the time. I was just working on it earlier and I've been honing this deck for almost 20 years. So, little things here and there. The way this works, I'll cover the slides. I tend to move a little bit quickly through the deck. This is my style of presentation. But the nice thing is we will send you a copy of the slides. So you'll have them at your disposal if you want to look back at the data a little bit later. We'll also send you a link to the presentation. So if you want to watch it again, any segment of it, if you want to share it with a spouse, with a child, it'll be there for you. We'll also have some Q&A. If there's a question during the presentation, like I don't understand this thing on the slide, it makes sense, so just pop it in the Q&A. Otherwise, we'll have lots of open Q&A at the end if there are any questions that I didn't answer throughout the presentation. So without further ado, let's jump right in. So testing, what is it? Where does it live? It's always been one of the top three or four things in admissions for many, many decades. Grades are always first. If you're ever wondering what's more important, my testing or my GPA, my academic rigor, your academic rigor, that's how many APs or IBs or dual enrollment, your honors classes, and then the GPA in those classes, that's always first. That predicts really strongly for performance in college, and that's what colleges really care about. But after that, testing is always right behind grades. And then below that, things drop off considerably. This is a poll, NACAC, it's the College Admissions Counselors and Directors of, the admissions office at Oglethorpe and Vanderbilt and Swarthmore and Penn and Texas. And they say, what's important to you? And all these schools answer. And typically, this is from all the answers from hundreds of admissions directors. Then you have the essay below testing and GPA. Then you have demonstrated interest, which is how much an involvement you have with the school, which is important for many schools, not the very top. Then counselor recs, teacher recs, activities, and so forth. But the big ones are the academic solids. That's going to be the big show is your GPA, your academic rigor and testing. And then that kind of gets you into the game. If those aren't there, you may have the most amazing activities on the planet, but if they don't feel like you're going to thrive at our school, it's going to be tough to get an offer of admission. So I think there was a question. All right. So tonight, before we get too far into the weeds of this material, we're going to do a quick poll. It's literally, I think it's like 3 questions. We're just getting a feel for who you are tonight. And, in terms of where you are in the process, are you a student? Are you a teacher? Are you a parent? Do you have a student who's a sophomore, junior? And also things that you're interested in terms of, for us, if you're here, you're looking for work with testing. And then if you want any help, we'll help you. So click one of these, it'll take all of 30 seconds, and then you can close that one out. All right. So, and let us get back to the content at hand. After you finish that, it'll disappear. And so again, this is the big show, testing, grades, and so forth. Make sure the numbers are solid, and then everything else matters below that. But if your numbers aren't strong, it's tough. That's the way it works. So, all right, next up, testing. In brief, there are 2 primaries, SAT, ACT. The SAT is more rigorous when it comes to reading. It has a much higher reading level. It's about an 11th grade reading level versus the ACT is on a 9th grade reading level. That's a big difference. ACT has more advanced math and a standalone separate science section, which actually measures some scientific knowledge and fluency. So it is a more rigorous STEM test. The overlap between the 2 tests is roughly 80%. These tests resemble each other. They look a lot alike. If I prep for one, I'm prepping for the other. Very similar reading skills, just the reading level is higher on the SAT, almost identical English and grammar skills between the writing on the SAT and the English on the ACT. They both have science graphs and reading. They both have algebra and stats, but there are some differences. And I'll go through again some of the differences. Structurally, for the moment, we have another 2 years until these start to diverge again. Because we know that the digital SAT is coming for current freshmen, rising sophomores. you will be the first class in history to have everyone take a digital SAT starting in March of 2024. That's when the paper SAT is going to be retired in the US. And the format is going to look very different. And the test is going to go from 3 hours to about 2 hours. And it's going to just change. And we're getting rid of the no calc math section. But for right now, these are structurally very similar tests. Reading, writing in big blocks, math. The one differentiating point is there's going to be a separate science section for the ACT. And the essay is still limping along for the ACT, but it has no meaning, no bearing, no purpose. It'll die. I'm expecting an announcement within the next year. I would not be surprised if we get an announcement this summer saying they're going to sunset the ACT essay within, let's say by the December ACT, because it's just no longer relevant. And when the SAT killed theirs, that was really the death knell for the essay for the ACT. So that's coming. One key distinction that it's really important that your students take a practice test. There's a question, will this recording be shared later? Yes, it will. We're going to share a copy of the deck, and we'll share a link. You can go back and watch this, share this with a neighbor, friend, spouse, and it'll be there for you. Okay, so in terms of speed and pacing, this has always been a major differentiating factor that the College Board, it was at this point now 2013, when David Coleman, who was the newly minted president and CEO of the College Board, got in front of the group at NACAC and said, we're going to put less focus on speed. We're going to de-emphasize processing speed. And when the redesigned SAT came out in 2016, he was true to his word. They reduced the number of items, but kept the test the same length. So effectively, he gave kids a lot more time per question. So that's really been a big deal. So compared to the ACT, you have 40% more time per question, which is really meaningful. For a math question on the SAT, you have 84 seconds compared to having a straight minute on the ACT. Similarly, on the reading section, you have an extra 22.5 seconds per question. That's over 40% more time. That's a big deal for a lot of students. And on the redesigned digital coming in 2 years SAT, they're giving kids even more time per question, having even fewer items, because they're doing an adaptive test, which is more efficient and economical. I can get to the same answer giving you 40 math questions versus giving you 60. So that's going to give kids even more time. That's one of the reasons why the test is shorter, but also they'll give you a little bit more time per question. That's a pretty cool thing. So make sure your kids that can handle the pacing of the ACT before you lock into a testing plan. And the way you determine that is by taking a practice test. And Apple Ruth gives well over 10,000 of those per year. So if you need a practice test, we do a lot of those. Okay. So mathematics is one area where these things do diverge between the SAT and the ACT. The ACT has more advanced math. And in the SAT, the College Board is doing a very deep dive into a very narrow pool of subjects, essentially is algebra and algebra 2. They're looking at graphs, they're looking at function notation, they're looking at algebraic exponents, plotting graphs. It's very isolated, very simple. Whereas the ACT covers a lot of content in a very shallow way. They may ask you one question about matrices, one question about ellipses, things that never appear on the SAT. And additionally, the SAT is more text heavy. It's more applied mathematics. They rarely give you the abstraction of here's an equation, solve it. It's more, they give you this scenario, they give you a paragraph of reading, and your job is to interpret and tease out what math are they asking me here to do, given this context. So it's really, it's math in context, it's applied math. Whereas ACT really is more, here's the math, here's the problem, and solve it. So different styles of math, and some students prefer one over the other. In terms of the percentages of items, you have more algebra. You have about 2/3 of the test is algebra on the SAT compared to under half for the ACT. Geometry is one differentiator. You have roughly 3 questions of geometry on the SAT compared to typically 14 on the ACT. That's a big difference. They both have data analysis, looking at some stats, some charts, some tables. And then trig, you're going to have 0 or 1, maybe 2 at the most questions of trig on the SAT, versus you typically have 4 on every ACT. So these are some differences in terms of content. And I mentioned that you're always going to have some more advanced material, asymptotes, lines of best fit, ellipses, conic sections. They're going to look for domains and ranges of functions, really more advanced material. like deeper into algebra 2 and trig than you ever see on the SAT. That's just part of the, that their structure is a lot of content, but in a very shallow way. All right. The name of the game is do a practice test. Before you start anything, before you start new preparation, figure out which test is my better test. Some kids, they're better on one or the other. Some kids are neutral, in which case you defer to the student preference. And the range I use it's 60 points on the SAT scale. That's the margin of error. If you add up the margin of error on both tests, what that means is if I get a 26 on the ACT, but then I get a 1290 on the SAT, which is the equivalent of like a 20, a 29. In that case, I'm more than 60 points past my score on the ACT, and I'm going to go all the way to on the SAT. However, if I get a 26 on the ACT and I get a 1230, 1240, that's when the margin of error on both tests. So it could be on a given day, those numbers could flip. So in that case, I asked the student, which one felt better to you, more natural, and go with that one. But if I'm more than that 60 points on the SAT scale, there's no preference. It's just you're better on this test. That's our test. Off we go. When it comes to building out your plan for testing, we advocate that students plan on taking the test officially 3 times. So I'm looking at either taking 3 official SATs or 3 official ACTs. Many of our students are one and done. That's lovely. That's the best outcome is a kid preps hard, they do their practice tests, and boom, the first test, they're finished. However, like one of my good friends, it's funny, then now my friends, their kids are now juniors and seniors in high school. As I've been out of school for many, many years. One of my good friends from high school, his daughter started off, she had a 30 out of the gate on the ACT, and her goal is UT Austin, a really, very competitive school from a kid from Georgia especially. And on her first test, she worked hard, got a 32, making progress towards our goal. And I told my friend Josh, ideally we hit a 33, our stretch goals are 34. So out of the gate, the kid got a 32 on her first test. Baseline score of a 30, worked a little bit, got 2 points, then did it one more time on the next ACT. I think it was the February test, and then got a 33. Like, all right, let's do one more roll. Let's try for the April ACT. And lo and behold, the third test, 34. And so that was a stretch. But typically, again, we're seeing that as we're working, we're prepping, we're seeing there's a return on our efforts. We're putting in energy and time and content, and then we're getting the score improvement. So some students, they walk in there and just crush it out of the gate, but many kids, and looking at, we have a data set of 40,000 students. And typically on average, most of our students hit their best score on average on their third test. So that's why we advocate this. But again, some are one and done, some are two and done, but typically kids who are working hard, prepping in earnest, reviewing their mistakes, tend to peak on the third test. So that's why I recommend it with lots of data. There's also a question when you're building out your testing plan. Hey, I've heard that the April ACT is really hard, or I've heard that the June test is easier. Is that true? Not true. And ultimately, even though in a given calendar year, you might have a harder June math section and then an easier math section in April, that doesn't bear out over time. If I look for a trend or a pattern over years, it falls to pieces. So even if someone says, hey, December is really a tough test, don't take it, that isn't a true thing. So ignore that. You want to build your testing plan based on your calendar, when it makes sense for you, when you have time to prep in earnest, but not thinking I should really avoid October because I've heard it's a hard test. Ignore that information. Things that help contribute to higher final scores and better outcomes. This was my PhD research, which I published in a few journals. Practice testing. We know that practice tests help contribute to better overall net outcomes, higher score gains. When you spread the practice out over time, if looking at the same amount of prep, let's say 10 hours of prep over 2 weeks or over 2 months, the kids who spread it out tend to do better. You need time between sessions to practice, to forget and relearn, to reinforce learning. Kids who start earlier as juniors tend to do better than those who start at the end of junior year. That was part of the research. Kids who put in more time on task, not surprisingly, they do better on the SAT and on AP exams, on everything, chemistry exams. So when you put in more time, you tend to do better. Kids who tend to finish strong, you don't want to do a big prep class in the summer and then go in there cold and take it in March. There's too much time to lose the material and forget it. So you have to reinforce it, and you want to, within a month of every official SAT or ACT, I want students to have a full-time practice test to make sure there's some momentum being built, so you aren't just walking in very cold. And then again, as I mentioned, my friend's daughter was going for a 34, but she started off with a 30 and had a goal. And every time, all of our sessions, all of our practice, we're working towards that goal. And that helps you with motivation, helps you with your staying on task. And it's, having a short-term, proximal goal is very helpful for many reasons. When you build your plan for testing, there's a very linear, simplified plan these days. You're going to have 7 SATs every year and 7 ACTs every year. If you happen to take your ACT in December, April, or June, there's something called the test info release, where I give them $20 or so and they mail me back my test. That's very helpful for if you're prepping with a tutor, by yourself, just to see what you missed when you were in an actual controlled environment, and then why, and then review that pretty hard, make sure you have those all nailed before your next test. In a similar fashion for the SAT, they return the question and answer service on October, March, and May. And that's pretty nifty that as soon as you finish your test, you go and pay this money, they give you access right then and there to go and review the items you took 2 days earlier. And that's really helpful for kids who are prepping, trying to increase their scores. In terms of what's going on for the SAT, we know there were some big changes in the past year. They retired officially the subject tests, and they dropped the essay. Those were big moves, which may have affected your kids. We also know that the digital SAT is coming. It'll only affect current freshmen, rising sophomores. Doesn't affect you if you're a junior, or obviously if you're a senior, you're done. But if you're currently a freshman, this affects you. And if you are currently, if you're currently a sophomore or a junior, don't worry about this. So we know there's more time. There's a wider range of topics. And honestly, I'm going to be giving so many more talks about this over the next 2 years. So this will first show up on the PSAT when current freshmen are juniors. That'll be in October of 2023, which is 4 months, 5 months and a year. So we'll have plenty of time to review these changes, but it's kind of a high level overview of what's coming. And there'll be a lot more coming. They're going to actually release materials for practice this summer. They say they're going to release 2 full practice tests, but again, this shouldn't really affect anyone. It affects more international kids who are going to be taking it starting in March of next year. So that's a big deal for current sophomores if you're overseas. But in the US, only freshmen. They're going to work out the kinks first with the international kids, which is I think a good, smart play. ACT, we are waiting for some big news from the ACT. In September of 2020, the game plan was they were going to release the option for computer-based testing in the classroom and sectional testing. So if I wanted to, I can go in there into my school and just take the math and the science section on a Saturday and then go home, or just take the math section if I had a full test under my belt. Then the pandemic hit, we all remember very well, in February, March, and then these plans were delayed indefinitely. But now that the College Board has announced their digital test, I'm expecting an announcement potentially this summer or in the fall when they say here's our new timeline, because obviously everything is going digital eventually, because paper, there are problems with paper. It's not as secure. You can do a shorter test with computer-based testing. So, but we're still in a holding pattern here. They also are automatically generating a Superscore. So as long as you have more than one test, they generate the Superscore and you press a button, you can send it right to any college. Although the majority of colleges in the country, they let you do self-reporting. And what that is on the Common App, I list my test scores. I got a 27 on the June ACT. I got a 29 on the July ACT. And I list my subscores and I send it. And we'll talk about that. But only if I'm accepted do I have to send my official scores. And now I can send in this Superscore report, the schools who abide by that. Only a few schools will want individual scores reports, but this just saves you some money. I think it's pretty nifty. All right, so talking about testing, we can't not talk about test optional, because that has been the story of the pandemic and beyond. I've been in the space for 20 years now, and going on 21. And so ultimately, the test optional movement was gaining traction, since 2006, 7, 8. And every year there were a couple more schools, Wake Forest, like 09, Chicago was 17, 18. Every little bit, a few more schools hop on, American, Worcester Poly, Smith, George Mason. But suddenly the pandemic hits and you all know the story. Test optional becomes the law of the land. And so, there's still a few other options. Test flexible, which is really less popular now that we're in the optional world. Test required is slowly coming back, and test blind is a small minority of schools. Here, I was working on this slide because I think it was last week, I think it was Thursday, we learned that Tennessee is now going to require SAT or ACTs from all students next year. Georgia did for this academic year. For next year, they're going to require it only for the flagships, UGA and Georgia Tech. And the reason for that is even they're having some problem with enrollment at some of the lower tier schools in Georgia. I have a good friend who's a tenured professor at Valdosta, and they're having problems getting freshmen in. And so the idea is let's get rid of any impediments. And so let's get rid of the requirement for testing to see if that helps. But the flagships, Georgia Tech and UGA, are getting record levels of applicants. They're not worried about this, and testing it is meaningful. Florida never dropped the requirement. If you want to go to Florida State or University of Florida, or Florida A&M, whatever it is, you have to have a test score. North Carolina announced about a month ago in March that tests were going to be required, for next year. But then they said, you know what? We realized there are some kids who had some pandemic learning loss. We're going to wait another 2 years until we've overcome some of the learning loss, make sure kids are ready. But they teased it. And also Texas, earlier this academic year, Texas came out and said, starting in 2 years, every kid applying to UT Austin, our flagship state school, have to have a test score for. But then they said, actually, we're going to wait a little bit more longer and see. But one of my colleagues and friends, Rick Clark, is the head of admissions for undergraduates at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. He said, he said months and months and months ago, even over a year ago, don't count on the South. When it comes to test optional, it's like South Carolina may be coming, Alabama, it's likely coming, Mississippi, maybe even Virginia. And part of it, Virginia has a very different acceptance rate for students with test scores and without. It's much higher. I think it's like 89% higher kids with scores than without scores. And that's one indication that they may make a move. They seem to be giving preference to kids with test scores. So we may see this map filling in for the publics in the South. There was a big news story about a month ago. MIT came back and said, now we are test required. And then Georgetown, and then there are more coming. One of my friends in the industry said he's heard a lot of news about, you think Tulane may be coming on this list, and then others as well. So again, it's only May. Schools will be announcing this over the next several months and over the summertime, but we expect we're going to have quite a number of schools adding this back in. So little by little, because during the pandemic, they queried hundreds of schools, and roughly about a quarter to a third said we expect that we're going to be test required within 3 to 5 years. It's still plenty of time, and many schools are waiting and seeing, but we know we're going to see some schools trickling back in. It's optional. What optional means is that if you don't have a test score, they're going to read your application. You have a chance of admission. It is a complete application. It's your choice. The same as APs. You don't have to send a single AP or IB score, but if you have them, you include them. You don't, if you have leadership or you have the choice of whether you send it or not. Over 1,820 schools are currently test optional, and there were roughly 1,000 before the pandemic. And so I'd say there are schools who are truly test optional, who are, aligned with this in terms of philosophically, it was their choice. I think about Worcester Polytechnic up in New York. I think about Wake Forest. They were optional 12, 13 years ago. I think about, there are quite a few schools. I'm thinking of, George Mason, schools who have been on this for years. Then there are schools who are forced to because of the pandemic and kids couldn't get testing and COVID. And so we're still waiting and seeing what happens over the next couple of years. But test optional, there's a very, very, very good chance test optional is going to stay the dominant academic policy in the country for forever, most likely. So again, schools who require, also there are some the military academies and a few others. But there are more coming. I should add the UT schools in Tennessee. Again, I mentioned the survey that about a quarter of schools said they'll be required, but about 2/3 said they're not going to be required. They're going to be optional, and only 5-10% of they're going to be test blind. So that's not going to be the dominant position in the country, because it's saying we're not going to look at it at all. We refuse to consider, like if you have a bunch of 5s on the APs, we're not going to even consider them. If you have a perfect test score, that's an extreme position. And apart from the schools in California and a few others, there really aren't that many, schools going that direction. Most of them are waiting. Like Harvard made a big announcement that, we want 4 more years. We want to see the kids coming in with test scores and those without, and are there differences in GPA, differences in course taking, major selection, differences in graduation rates. And you need time to figure that out before they make any permanent moves. So most of them are just waiting. They want more data, and then they'll determine from there. I mentioned Rick Clark said the South. I need to change that. So North Carolina came in, then they came right out. There are some changes that have taken place there. And Harvard said, give us several more years. We want to really take a look at the graduating classes to figure out what to do with our policy for the future. And so many schools are going to follow Harvard. Harvard is a leader, obviously. The Supreme Court, they're listening during this cycle to a case about affirmative action. And one thing that we know is that if the Harvard UNC case, if the Supreme Court rules that we're not going to have any more affirmative action in the country, which they certainly could, it seems like they're willing to make some very bold moves, overturning other things. Right now, you can use race, ethnicity in a narrowly tailored fashion. There have been several cases where there's precedent now, but they may say no more with that. And then if you can't use ethnicity, race, and admission, we're going to see a lot of colleges that say we're staying test optional, because that's been one issue in terms of giving schools cover, because if there are differences in admit rates by ethnicity or difference in test scores, but you're using, if you're considering ethnicity, race, and admission, there's some issues here. So we'll see what happens with this, but know that this could be a big factor, and I'll be writing about it in our blog if it happens. We're watching this closely. One of the important things to think about is that test optional does not mean test blind. I've heard this many times. The tests don't really count this year, and that's not what test optional means in the least. Test blind, you're right. You could have a 36 and apply to UC Riverside, and it doesn't even matter. But having a 36 and applying to a school that's test optional, that can be a major impact on your application. Test blind, there aren't that many. UC and Cal State, Cal State Fullerton, UC, Berkeley, UC Irvine. Your top test score in the country doesn't mean a thing for them. Worcester Poly, they're doing an 8-year pilot. Then there are a few, like middle school, like Catholic, they're not that competitive. Then there's St. Mary's, some smaller schools, St. Mary's, Northern Michigan, Northern Illinois, and then a few others that are temporarily test blind, like Caltech. But Caltech, they could, after MIT went test required, Caltech's private. They might go back too. Who knows? And then a few others. So Dickinson, CUNY, we'll find out. Test scores can affect your merit-based aid. My niece, she applied to 9 schools. She got into 8 of them. She did very, very well. She applied to several schools where they offered her merit-based aid because she had, good academics. One of the big scholarships she applied to the University of Alabama. They offered her $96,000 off for 4 years of tuition because of her test score and her grades. That's a big deal. She also applied though to Tulane, got in there. She did not send her test score to Tulane, but they also offered her money because of her grades and rigor were really good. So in some places, your scores can affect, others they can't, but test scores can definitely be part of it. The same for the UT scholarships for Tennessee, Knoxville, like they have scholarships they're tied directly to your test scores. Here I mentioned Alabama. They've always been, for over a decade, they've used merit-based aid for test scores and grades. And given a 3.5 GPA, which many, many kids have, every point or two you get on the ACT, they start throwing real money at you. And again, my niece had a 1390. They said tuition for you is not going to be $30,000 a year. And it's going to be $6,000 a year. So she's saving $24,000 a year. Though she decided to go to University of South Carolina, but different story. She wanted to be in her home and so forth. Other merit scholarships, Utah State, a few others, Texas Tech, Lake Forest. So, they're giving merit scholarships for test scores and grades. There are many, many more of these. We picked a few. I live in Georgia, and our top scholarship is a merit-based scholarship. If you want the Zell Miller, which means free tuition at UGA and Tech, then you need a 3.7 GPA minimum, and you also need a 1,200 or a 26 on the ACT. So that's a merit-based scholarship here in Georgia. Okay. So one of the things we're seeing, one of the trends with testing is that test optional has made schools very, very selective. Many of you know this. There are huge applications, increases, and colleges, then they're dealing with this massive influx of applicants. Then they're not sure if, which kids are serious about us. I've heard, some kids are applying to 10, 15, even 20 schools. So colleges giving out offers of acceptance, they don't really know, are kids going to come? Yield rates are lower and lower. So one of the things that have happened, because more kids are applying, test optional, is that early decision is becoming a lot more of a big deal. Schools are filling more and more of their class early decision, and early action is less meaningful as kids are just applying to more and more schools. So, test scores used to be a major predictor of yield. What that means is, if I have a 1300 on the SAT and I get into a school, if I get into a school that I'm kind of hitting above the belt, like if I get into, let's say a Wake Forest with a 1300, that's a really, really good school for a score like that. They would know that given my test score, I'm probably going there. However, if I had a 1580 on the SAT, Wake Forest might know that given my test score, I'm going to probably be swinging for something higher than Wake Forest. I may be shooting for a Duke, or maybe shooting for an Ivy, or something like that. So the test score helped them predict who would accept the offer. But now with a lot of kids not attending test scores, they have less information of who will actually come if you give them an offer. And so what schools are doing is using more and more early decision where you're locking yourself in. If you give me an offer, I'm going to your school. That's a big thing. And schools are also, they're using like really long wait lists. If they miss their numbers and then too few kids take their offers, they have these huge wait lists of 8,000 kids, even if they only go like 150 kids deep in the wait list, things like that. A few things here, just admit rates. They just, things have gotten more competitive at every school, the big state schools, at the private schools. Things are, that's the nature of things now. Now we're seeing many, many more schools in the singles and double digits, like low doubles. And that's, it's harder. Here I mentioned the early decision change, like Barnard is filling 2/3 of their school. Tulane, they're just locking in so many kids. Now I heard Tulane reps say, if you aren't applying early, it's really going to be very challenging. They're filling almost 6 in 10 spots early decision. Then they're filling in another 2 or 3 out of 10 early action. That's leaving a very small number for the kids applying regular decision. So we're seeing similar things at many schools where they're popping Penn's over 50 and Emory and Duke. So they're locking in half the class from a pretty small pool. And that's one of the reasons there is a real advantage applying early decision compared to applying regular and so forth. When you don't have a test score, Cornell and many other schools say we're going to have more scrutiny on everything else. We're going to look more closely at your rigor and your GPA, which makes sense. If you have other testing, if you don't have an ACT score, but you send us AP scores, we're going to look more closely at those. If there's 4 legs of a stool, we take a leg away, then the other 3 legs are going to get more of that weight. We do know that the number of kids submitting test scores has decreased quite a bit, pre-pandemic to currently. Roughly half of the kids in the country sent test scores, but that wasn't distributed evenly. We know that there are a larger portion of male students sending test scores. Typically, that's going to be for the STEM programs, if they're applying more to engineering programs or math programs, computer science. That's where you want to showcase that math score. It's more helpful. Additionally, we see more strategy in submission. Before the pandemic, only 4 of 100 kids would send scores to some schools, but not others. But now it's over a quarter, maybe even closer to half. They didn't get that data this year. So that means kid gets a 30 on the ACT, they're applying to 10 schools, they may send that 30 to 5 schools and not to 5 schools. So that's using strategy, very smart. And we do know also that even though the numbers are up 50%, in 2020, we saw a real difference between kids submitting test scores to the more selective schools than the less selective schools. For both the privates and the publics, if you're shooting for a more selective school, you tend to have a test score on average more than the schools who are less selective, which makes sense. You're trying to stand out in a crowded pool. Why wouldn't you try to stay, if you have a good test score, send it. And also there are differences by major, that over half of kids, sent test scores like this to a major school, but 3/4 of engineering kids sent test scores, over half of business, and only 1/3 of gen ed kids and social work kids. So ultimately, if you're trying to showcase, if you need that math score, you tend to submit those SATs and ACTs on average. Now, the question I get asked all the time is, does having a test score make a difference? That's the whole thing of, does test optional, is there an advantage? And we don't have data from a lot of schools because schools have no reason to publish the data. Over 200 plus schools took a pledge through NACAC that they wouldn't give an advantage to kids with test scores. Included are the schools on this list. But looking at the data, it's interesting. Emory, their admit rate without test scores, 8 out of 100 kids. Their admit rate with test scores is 17 out of 100. So you have an increase of 100% essentially. Same thing with Georgia Tech, same thing with Virginia. Your odds of getting in without a test score are about 13%. Your odds with a test score are about 25%. So there's a difference here. But the majority of schools aren't giving us this data. They're not public with it. They have no reason to share it. It's not being gathered on the common data set. So we just don't have access to this data anymore. But the data that we saw made you think, there's a difference here. And I'd heard this even 10 years ago for Wake Forest admits that, kids with test scores were getting into Wake Forest at a higher rate. There's an issue here of correlation versus causation. Correlation is, hey, kids with test scores on average tend to also have better academic rigor and higher grades and other things. So that's saying the test scores are pointing to other things. The test scores aren't the important factor. Then there's causation. And I've given a talk with someone from Emory, and she was very clear. We have 2 kids from the same high school. They have similar academic rigor, 7 APs, 7 APs. This kid has a 33, 34 on the AC. This one has no testing. Well, for our admissions office, that 33, 34 is going to have an impact on their outcome. So in that case, having a test score is causally related and linked, but we can't know the percent of that causal increase. Is it 30%? It contributes something, but we don't know exactly how much. But it does seem to be that having a test score does help, at these schools that are test optional. There's a question of, should I bother trying the tests? And ultimately, I think before you do anything, get a baseline test, look at the schools on your list. And if I'm looking at schools, they're super selective. I have amazing grades, amazing rigor. On average, the schools I'm looking at, they want like a 33 on the ACT. I do my practice test and get a 19. In that case, it's not worth it. I'm not going to go up 14 points. And so in that case, let me focus on my grades, everything else. However, the schools I'm looking at on average, they range of schools, they want a 31, 32, 33. I go and take a practice, I get a 28. Okay, I'm in the ballpark. If I work hard, I have a good increase, then my score could contribute. But it really comes down to, could I get into a range where it could help me? And then once you have your test scores, let's say you get a 33, do I send it? The question here is, will this test score add value? Do I think it's going to contribute and help? So Jeff Selingo's an author I respect and like, said, you know what? He's seeing a difference in admission outcomes for STEM kids and business kids, that if you have test scores, they're getting in at higher rates. So, because again, schools want to find out, are they ready for the advanced math? Many schools who were like businessy schools, they used to lean heavily on the SAT subject tests. If I'm applying to a business degree or a computer science degree, I look at the math 2, which was pre-calculus, but now that math 2 doesn't exist, let me see if you got a 33, 34 on the ACT math section. That'll help me figure out, can you handle the academic rigor of our really advanced math or science section? Then there's a certain score below which you shouldn't send it. Like a school like Cornell, where their middle range is a 680 to a 760 in verbal and 720, 800 in math. Sean said, if you get a 650 or below, do not send it. That's not going to help you in any way. So there are certain scores below which you shouldn't send, period. And also your major matters. Again, if you're applying for a business major at Cornell or engineering, then your test score matters more than if you're going to be a fine arts major or performing arts major. And Rick said, look at that middle 50 range. If you're in the top half, send it. If you're below, the question is, do you think it'll help you? And if you're in the bottom quartile, below that mid-range, I wouldn't send it, he said. Go with your strengths. You want to control the conversation and don't have them talking about your lower test score, if you can help it. But now tech, it's required. And so that was an older slide from a previous time, but that's a good advice still for schools across the country. And then also your GPA matters. Like my cousin had a phenomenal GPA, like unweighted, like a 3.9, like unweighted. It's a rock star, almost always. And so her testing was good, but then applying to two-lane, the two-lane rep said, if you have below a 1420, don't send it. And she had a 1390. And so she applied Tulane just with her 3.9 and all of her academic rigor, and she got in. So in that case, to a school like Tulane is trying to push their test scores, that her 1390 wouldn't help her. However, that score did help her at many other schools like Georgia, got in Georgia and got into South Carolina and other places where she did send test scores. So it varies, depends. But if you have a rocking GPA and great rigor, the question is, will my test score contribute, or do I want to have the whole conversation be about my GPA and my rigor? And also the individual scores matter. If I'm applying to, again, an engineering, STEM, math, science, business program, and I have a strong math score in there, even if my verbal is a little bit weak, I want to showcase that 770 on math. Even if my verbal is a 620 and I'm below their middle 50, I want to make sure the committee sees my 770 before I go into my accounting and finance classes. And finance is all calculus, for the most part, derivatives and so forth. So in that case, I would still send a score, even if it's a really good high score embedded in a section I want to showcase. And part of it, you can't unsee a weak score. Don't ever send them a score. It's going to become part of the conversation. If you don't want it in there, please don't send it. And treat every school differently. You can submit, you can check the box on the Common App or the Coalition app, but every single one should be a look at their range and decide go, no go. Strengthen will help me or weaken. Here's an example. Swarthmore is a competitive school. Their middle range for half of their class in 2020 was a 1380 to a 1540. So if I have a 1470 or above, send it. It's going to help you. If I'm below a 1380, I probably would not send it on almost any condition, unless I had a 790 on one thing and I wanted them to see that. But the real gray area is that third quartile on the low end of the middle 50 range. Let's say, and there's a difference. If I have a 1460, then I probably send versus having a 1390. Additionally, how good are my grades? If my test scores are relatively stronger than my grades, send your scores. If my grades are that 3.9 and a bunch of rigor, then I might withhold that test score and stand alone on the merits of my academic performance in high school, not my testing. So there's some of that nuance there in that conversation. And be mindful that ranges that we're seeing now after 2020 are skewed. What I tell people is look back 2 years, go back to before the pandemic to see what their testing was like, just to give you a sense of what normal looks like. Because and look at the common data set, it's a CDS, look at the common data set Tulane 2020 and type it in. Because here's an example of what happened with Georgia before the pandemic. Their middle 50, let's say for the SAT, was a 1220 to a 1390. Those are numbers I've seen for years. Pandemic hit, and they say scores are optional. Boom, you have a third of the class doesn't send scores suddenly, and those are the lower scoring kids. Now the middle 50 is a 1350 to a 1490. So if a parent asks me, should I send a 1340 to Georgia? I say, yes, you should. Even though it got skewed and inflated because of the non-submission effect, when I look back to 2020, before the pandemic, a 1340, that's a very respectable score for Georgia. And I'd rather them see that score. So that's why I say, look at the common data set, type it in. It's like under testing, you'll see it's like C9, their incoming freshman class, the middle 50 percentile. It's also, and then do a look back before you submit. Boston University, same thing. Their mid 50 range pre-pandemic, it was a 30 to a 34. Then suddenly you lop off all the lower scoring kids, and now their middle range is a 33 to 35. If someone says, I have a 32, should I send it? I'm inclined to say yes, based on, or a 33 for that matter, of course, looking back at where they were before the pandemic. Penn also went crazy, my alma mater. Their middle range was a 33 to a 35. Then Penn got rid of their bottom 40% with test optional. And then now their middle range is a 35 and up, which means 3/4 of their class has a 35 or 36. That's just telling you all the kids with lower scores can send them. Should I send a 34 to Penn? Yes, 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 and yes. But you wouldn't think so looking at only the data after the pandemic. So that's why I want a year look back. And here's just some examples of that. We're seeing like Emory popped, all the schools popped. Look at Vermont, went from an 1180 to 1340 in middle range, then up to a 1280 to a 1460. So we're seeing some big pops with the pandemic effects. If you want to learn more about going to college, building a good application, we're actually doing these free sessions For the class of 2025, we're doing a session on May 11th and 25th. And for the class of 2024, we're doing a session on May 18th. We're working with admissions officers, we're working with other counselors, telling you about all the pieces that today I was looking at testing, but there's obviously a lot more than testing. So if you want to learn more, look at these dates. These are always very helpful talks. I'll talk briefly about admissions testing, but for the most of it, it's going to be about everything else. And things that we do here at Apple Ruth, we help you with your SATs and ACTs. We help you with academics. We did tons of AP work for the past few months. And also we do executive functioning coaching, helping kids get more organized, get ready to do well in high school and in college. I personally work with quite a number of kids in high school and in the college level, and I enjoy that work. So let's take questions. What questions have I not answered? I'm going to open it up here, and let's open it. Are there any questions? And if not, it's okay. What time is it? It is now 8:46. Okay. What if there are no questions? That's okay too. Well, everybody, we're going to send you a copy of the deck and the slides. So please feel free to join us again for one of those presentations coming up in a couple weeks. And everyone, if you need any help with testing, with grades, Apple Ruth is here, and we'd love to help. All right, y'all. Have a good night.